Jeremy, given your background in this line of work, I'd like to begin with you. For our viewers who couldn't see today's live coverage, who have only seen snippets of it, sum up what we witnessed today and sum up for us, if you can, the gravity of what we learned today on live television.
Well, the significance of today really was the putting forth of the whistleblower complaint. The acting director of national intelligence, Admiral McGuire, appeared before the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence, and his testimony really centered around the process by which that complaint was shared with the White House, the Justice Department, and then ultimately, after some machinations inside the executive branch, belatedly shared with Congress. But that wasn't the real headline, Brian. The real headline were the allegations laid out in meticulous, polished detail by an intelligence community whistleblower, outlining a months-long effort by the President of the United States to engage in a secret, parallel effort to pressurize President Zelensky of Ukraine, using Rudy Giuliani as a go-between, ultimately culminating in that July 25th phone call, the transcript of which we saw yesterday, and the whistleblower's complaint exactly tracked that transcript. And just in terms of the significance, Brian, we've never had an impeachment allegation against a president go to the House of Representatives that is this serious. This is not the Office of Tenure Act violation under the Johnson administration. This is not the lying about sex in the Clinton administration. This is about soliciting foreign interference in a United States election. It is the most serious impeachment allegation ever against the president of the United States.
Susan Page, that is saying a lot, and it's impactful to hear that from a guy like Jeremy Bash. Combining your head and your heart to answer this, what does this feel like to you, given the number of years you have covered Washington?
You know, I never expected to cover one impeachment, which I did, and now I believe I'm going to be covering a second. And what is extraordinary about what's happened is 8 days ago, it was only 8 days ago that the Washington Post disclosed that there was a whistleblower complaint out there that had with questions raised about the president and his conversation with a foreign leader. In the space of a week and a day, we have moved from impeachment being something that the president and most people in Congress thought was now off the table to something that is a very real possibility. We now have a majority of the House, as you noted, backing some impeachment. Nancy Pelosi doesn't need to get any of the 12 remaining Democrats to back this. She has a majority of the House ready to move forward without them. And I think we have every sign that that speed that we saw in the last week and a day is going to continue, with the prospect that we could have an impeachment vote in the House before the end of the year.
That is absolutely extraordinary to say and to hear. Matt, we also are aware of the due diligence that still has to be done. As fast as this thing is now moving, again, just over the course of today, think of all the names we saw mentioned and learned about today. All of those tributaries have to be investigated. Are we talking about a future witness list before these committees that include some or perhaps all of these names? Not all these folks can claim any kind of privilege.
Well, that's hard to say, because if the House wants to move fast, you might not be able to get all of those people in front of you. And I think the investigation has to entail, too, some names that we don't know yet. The whistleblower in this case very explosively kind of alleged that other White House officials were concerned about a cover-up here. The whistleblower is not a direct witness, but he claims to be in touch with, I think, half a dozen White House officials who believe there might be a cover-up, in addition to concerns about this call with the Ukrainian president. And I'm sure the House, in their ideal world, would love to identify these people and talk to them. They would be kind of the key people who were in on this and who could describe it. You know, you saw Joe McGuire testify today, and he's a Trump, recent, I guess, Trump appointee that didn't want to sort of be out of step with the president, it didn't feel like to me. But these people who inside the government feel like they have concerns that President Trump is abusing his power, those would be the most compelling witnesses for the House to get in front of them to sort of push this impeachment inquiry forward.
And Matt, while I have you, explain to the folks watching who may not follow this quite as closely as you do, why the Attorney General is in such a bad place tonight.
Well, the Attorney General got involved in this whistleblower complaint because the Director of National Intelligence kind of reached out to him and said, what should we do with it? And Bill Barr's Justice Department decided that it should not be turned over to Congress. Further, Bill Barr's Justice Department treated this like a criminal referral. In addition to weighing whether this should be turned over to Congress, the Director of National Intelligence said, hey, this might be a crime. The president might have broken campaign finance laws that bar you from soliciting a thing of value, a campaign contribution from a foreign source. Barr's Justice Department in very short order decided they were not going to investigate that at all. They also decided that this complaint should not be handed to Congress. Those are two very controversial and perhaps questionable decisions. And the House is going to go after that, too, and see why Barr's Justice Department decided to do those things.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.